Go over to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the Vermont Library Association for having us today. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Burns. I'm the curator of manuscripts and university archivist at Silver Special Collections at the University of Vermont, and I also coordinate our digitization efforts. Today, we have a team of staff members and students here to tell you about the transcription work we've been doing this past year, and in particularly the transcription work on the diaries of Mary Jean Simpson that we've been working on these last few months. Each of our team members will introduce themselves to you when it is their turn in the presentation. And here's an outline of what we'll be covering today. So I will talk briefly about why we started transcribing, tell you a bit about the tool we use, and a little bit about what we've been transcribing and why. I'll hand it off to Erin, Hannah, Sharon, and Ingrid to talk about our workflow and documentation. Our students then, Dorothy, Mike, Tabitha, and Ibrahim, will share some of what they have been discovering in Mary Jean Simpson's diaries and why it matters. I will come back at the end to address some of the outcomes of this work, as well as some of our future plans. And then we'll all share some reflections before opening it up to you for questions. That's a lot to cover in 50 minutes, so let's get started. So why transcription? When we shifted to remote work last year, like many of you, due to the pandemic, we needed to figure out what that work was going to be. Most of our work involves hands-on tasks with our physical collections, which simply could not be done at home. Transcription, however, is a task we could get a fair number of people up and running on relatively quickly. While it's incredibly time-consuming work, it adds a lot of value to our collections, makes them more accessible. And we saw ways that we could build on this work by bringing it into the classroom, doing public programming, and including our student employees in a meaningful way. We weren't alone in reaching this conclusion. Many other institutions took on transcription work in this past year as well. Our colleagues at Middlebury have developed a number of transcription projects, for example. And we have a lot of experience building digital collections with transcribed text material dating back to our very first digital collection, the George Perkins Marsh Online Research Center, that was put together back in the late 1990s. And that looked like this back in the day. We've continued this work over the years, and on our digital collection site, you will find transcribed material in collections such as the Fletcher family papers, Vermonters in the Civil War, and women's suffrage in Vermont. So we had the infrastructure in place to handle the output of this work. We did, however, undertake a process to select a tool to help us more efficiently do the work, building on a review of transcription software that I had undertaken with an intern a couple of years before. The tool we selected is called Transcribus. It's a powerful tool originally developed at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and that is used by a whole host of institutions and individuals around the globe. We selected it because it's free for the most part, because it has a whole host of powerful features, and because its web-based transcription interface made it easy to implement for staff, for a classroom exercise, and for a crowdsourced project. You didn't need to download any software. So what have we been transcribing this last year? Well, we're up to about 7,000 pages transcribed, and the content has included letters from Justin Morrill, Vermont senator in the late 19th century, to the president of UVM, Matthew Buckham, the diaries of Caroline Crane Marsh between 1861 and 1865, when she and her husband first moved to Italy, where he was taking on the position of U.S. Minister to Italy. Several diaries of UVM students from different eras, and most recently a long run of the diaries of Mary Jean Simpson, which you'll hear more about in a couple of minutes. So now about a bit about how we actually do this work. The first step is scanning the materials. We had good equipment and processes in place already from our other digitization work. So the main issue has been finding time to do this work, especially early on in the pandemic. We did have some sense that we would be shifting to remote work, so we started scanning before the stay-at-home order went into effect. And we continued through the summer as a major piece of the essential work that was bringing me to campus for about a day a week over the summer, before we returned to more semi-normal operations last fall. To talk about the next step in our workflow, layout analysis, I'll hand it over to Erin Doyle.
Hi, I'm Erin Doyle, a staff member at Silver Special Collections. I mainly work on processing manuscripts, and I've been responsible for layout analysis in this transcription adventure. So I'm here to tell you why it's important and to discuss our general approach. Layout analysis is a pretty simple but a very detailed process to set up each page of each diary. There are two main reasons why we do this. The first is that everything that we want to capture in transcription needs to be marked in the software, so layout analysis is necessary for the upcoming step where we actually type in the written words, and you'll hear about that in a few minutes in detail from my colleagues. The second reason for doing layout analysis is that transcribing adds a lot of information to the scanned images of the original pages. From the user perspective, at the end of this process, the original pages can be displayed online simultaneously with the typed transcription that we're creating. Users can then perform a search there for any word, and search results can be highlighted in the image from the diary, which really increases its usefulness. To enable that search and highlight function, we've had to do some spatial layout work first. The workflow for layout analysis begins with an automated process within the client application that goes through and takes its best guess at a few important things. It determines what portion of the paper has been written on, it differentiates between individual lines of text, and then it determines the order of those lines relative to each other. Most of the time, the automated tool is accurate to a reasonable degree, and of course, this depends on the diary, the handwriting, all kinds of factors. But we also need a person to check line by line, making sure all the text is accounted for, and to remove anything that shouldn't be transcribed. There are several common types of manual revisions, and I'd like to quickly go over a few examples now. One of our core guiding principles on the overall project is to have the lines progress based on the logical flow or the meaning of what's been written, so that's a clear priority. Transcriber seems to judge order based on location of text, which certainly makes sense, but doesn't always match with reality. So when line order is incorrect in terms of flow, we can revise the elements. We also make subjective edits based on style guidelines so that each page of the diary appears consistent to other pages in the same volume. One common type of correction needed is demonstrated in the image on the right. Sometimes Transcribers doesn't capture the whole line or the entirety of a word. This often happens at the sides or edges of pages. It just seems to have trouble there. In this example, the middle line, sort of shaded in gray, shows what's been automatically captured, but the rest of the image is just the original scan. Hopefully you can see how the word after was incompletely captured and the next word I is omitted too. So to solve it, it's fairly simple. We just manually extend the line so that all of the original writing is included. In the next slide, we'll see another common issue, which is something being captured but it shouldn't have been captured. Here, it's a single apostrophe that just doesn't need to be its own individual line, and it would really kind of mess with the meaning if we left this one symbol floating on its own. It actually belongs with the whole of the word Jean, the name, it happens to be her cousin, and other similar cases are things like errant pen strokes or similarly floating quotation marks, the parts of letters that kind of move out of that main horizontal body of text. So when you cross a T or when you form a G and the tail kind of goes below the line, that can get captured in the same way as an error. So it's very easy again to fix this by just deleting this unnecessary capture. There are several tools in Transcribus that help us make these actual revisions, such as extending or deleting, as we've talked about. Other functions exist like redrawing if the capture just completely went haywire, and there's a join function, kind of the opposite of an unnecessary split, where you can bring back pieces that should be part of one line. There's also a very helpful undo button, so if the person laying things out makes a mistake, they can fix it. And with that, I will hand it off to Hannah to continue explaining our process.
Thank you, Erin. So my name is Hannah Johnson, and I'm on the staff at UVM Silver Special Collections. I've transcribed and reviewed transcriptions for this project, and I've also helped develop the documentation, which is what I'm going to be talking about right now. So for this project, we've used two different kinds of documents to organize our efforts, manifests and style guides. Our manifests are Excel spreadsheets in Microsoft Teams, and everyone involved with the transcription project has access to them and can edit them as needed. The primary purpose of these spreadsheets is to track our progress on a given project, but they've also become a convenient place for members of our team to ask questions, take notes, or flag problems that need to be addressed before the transcriptions are finalized. We also use the manifest to assign batches or groups of pages to each team member. So in this way, the manifests have helped us centralize task allocation and make it clear to everyone what's been done and what we still have to do on a given project. For each of our projects, we've developed a transcription style guide, which lays out our house rules for transcribing and also helps team members transcribe diaries and other manuscripts in a clear and consistent manner. Our style guides contain general rules for transcribing as well as tips that are specific to a given project. And one of the best things about these guides is that they're living documents, which means we can edit them or remove sections of them as we go along to make them as useful and concise as possible for our transcribers. So Chris will jump ahead to the next slide for me. Thank you, Chris. I'll show you what our project documentation actually looks like. So what you're looking at right now is the manifest for the Mary Jean Simpson diaries. Each column represents a specific step in the transcription process, and each cell represents a single diary page at any given point in that process. So columns A through C provide information identifying the uploaded pages, while columns D through G identify who uploaded the page, who did the layout analysis for it, who transcribed it, and who reviewed it. The last column, column H, is reserved for notes and questions, and we often drop links in there that'll lead to more information about the topics we've encountered in the manuscripts. Every team member has their own color, and when a batch of materials is assigned to them, the corresponding cells in the spreadsheet are blocked off in their color. Once they've completed an assigned batch, they add their initials to those cells so that the other members of the team can see that they've finished their batch and that those pages are ready for the next step in the process. And if Chris will jump ahead to the next slide, you'll see a page from the general rules section of our transcription style guide. Thanks, Chris. Whenever we start a new transcription project, we review this section of the guide, revise its content based on what we expect to encounter in the materials. And if we end up coming across something unanticipated while we're transcribing, we can tweak the content here again to reflect what we're actually seeing in the manuscript. The organization of the guide is fairly straightforward, with the section for each rule and subsections for rules that require a little bit more explanation. The project-specific rules appear at the very end of each of these guides, and at the top of this page, you'll see what I like to call our golden rule of transcription, which is that the first job of every transcriber is to transcribe what they see as it appears on the page. So those are the two different types of documents that we've been using for this project. And if Chris will jump to the next slide, Ingrid Bauer and Sharon Thayer will give you a quick introduction to the web interface for Transcribus.
Hello, I am Ingrid Bauer. I'm one of the members of the transcription team here at Silver Special Collections. Once you log on to Transcribus, you go to the document section and click on that, and the drop-down menu will give you a list of the diaries, in this case, chronologically by date. You click on 1964, which is the one some of us are currently working on, and this will bring you to a page of pages, and you click on one of those pages to continue. And this will bring you to a split screen. The top of the screen is the scanned diary page, and the bottom of the screen is where you type your transcription. To get started with a transcription, you click on the pencil, click to start. And this will just open up the page to be worked with. You click on line number 1 to get started. And once you do that, that highlights what Erin has been doing, and that is guiding the transcription process. She could have started with the very top written line, but to make sense of the progression of the page, it was set to start with the Saturday, November 21st. You type that in, type what you see, and Sharon Thayer is going to continue and tell you a little bit about the tools on this page.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Thayer, one of the staff in Silver Special Collections at UVM. So with this, when you're entering the data, you just type the first highlighted line, which is, as Ingrid said, usually the date. The layout highlights keep you in place, which is all the order of the diary. The text is typed in that box below. And if you look, there are little tools, a little toolbar right above it. And these are fairly self-explanatory, but they stand for superscript, subscript, underlining, strike throughs, undo and redo, and the ever popular unclear, and then some annotation. The unclear button is very useful. It's for illegible or faded handwriting, a phrase in a foreign language, or if you're not certain as to a person's exact place or exact name or a place name. This will flag the word or section for the reviewers. So to use these tools, you basically highlight the word that you've typed in, and then you touch whatever icon is appropriate for the date. If it was like November 21st, it would be the superscript for the ST, and then you could use the underline too. And you can, just like that, you can use two at the same time. Once any of this is done, you save. When the handwriting is challenging or it just doesn't make sense, just read the whole thing and to try to see what the whole sentence or paragraph is about. Context is often very helpful in figuring out what the illegible word or phrase is. When you are finished typing, you should read over everything you've done, compare it with the original, and then make corrections, fix typos, etc., and again, save. And then you're ready to change the status, which is ready for review from in progress. And now to my colleague, Erin Doyle, who's going to give us some biographical information on Mary Jean Simpson.
Thanks, Sharon. And to give you all some context for the upcoming readings, I'm going to just share a quick biographical sketch of Mary Jean. Born in 1888 in Craftsbury, Vermont, she was part of a close-knit family consisting of her parents and younger brother, John. She lived in a small neighborly community that included extended family and fellow members of the local United Presbyterian Church. She was active in her religious practice throughout her life, and we see clear examples of how it influenced her worldview and actions in the diaries. She was educated at Craftsbury Academy in the University of Vermont, graduating in 1913. She worked for several years as a teacher, including a lengthy stay at the People's Academy in Morrisville, where she became its principal in 1918. Her mother, Alice, had worked as a teacher before marrying, and education was to play a lasting role in Mary Jean's life. In 1924, she turned to politics and was one of 11 women to win a seat in the Vermont House of Representatives. All of these women were members of the Republican Party. She was the first woman from Orleans County elected into this seat, and it happened shortly after women gained the right to vote, so it seems likely these factors are connected. While serving, she was lauded for her abilities as a public speaker, and she spent a lot of time traveling around the state of Vermont to give speeches at meetings of various civic and social groups around this time. In 1926, when her term was up, she was appointed to the staff of the Secretary of the U.S. Senate, which meant moving to Washington, D.C. for part of the year. She was the first woman to work in the Secretary of the Senate office, and as the bill clerk, she was responsible for keeping records of Senate actions, including the text of legislation and vote data. When FDR was elected in 1933, that changed the balance of power from a series of Republican administrations to a Democratic one, and Mary Jean moved on. But she was still very much involved in government because she worked her way up to lead the Women's Division of the Works Progress Administration. She traveled across the country to review and advise on training projects for sewing, childhood nutrition, parenting, and other topics. The portrait shown here was painted by fellow Vermonter, fellow UVM alum, and fellow WPA associate, and also friend, Frances Colburn. She left the WPA in 1937 when the University of Vermont offered her the position of Dean of Women. She worked there for several years. During World War II, she established the Mary Jean Simpson Scholarship Fund, providing educational loans to returning veterans, both men and women. The fund helped support a tutoring program as well, and Mary Jean was also involved in the recruitment of students for the new nurse training program at UVM. In June of 1955, shortly after she retired, the women of the faculty created the Mary Jean Simpson Award in her honor. It continues to be awarded today at commencement to a senior woman student who best exemplifies the qualities of character, leadership, and scholarship. So most likely a reflection of Mary Jean herself and how they saw her. In November of 1955, she laid the cornerstone of the new women's dorm, Simpson Hall, clearly named after her. And in 1956, she was awarded an honorary degree from UVM. In her retirement years, Mary Jean remained active in many community educational, religious, and political groups like Delta Kappa Gamma, a professional society for women educators. She was on the board of trustees for Vermont State Colleges, St. Johnsbury Academy, the Sterling School, later Sterling College. There was a lot of activity with the United Presbyterian Women's Association, especially their missionary arm, and the YWCA was a lifelong connection. Also, the Vermont Council on World Affairs and the Vermont Republican Party claimed a good portion of her time. She enjoyed tending to her house and gardens, spending time with many friends, working shifts at the local library, and she also took advantage of travel opportunities, including international ones. The story concludes in 1977 when she died of cancer at the age of 89. We'll move on to the readings now. Our student colleagues have prepared some remarks drawn from the collection. Some of the readings will focus on recurring themes in her life that revealed themselves over the time that we spent with her words. These are the role of women as caretakers and the very impressive work ethic that is demonstrated in Mary Jean's nature. Other readings assess how a specific topic is addressed in the diaries, and here we chose the issues of race or racist language, and also the impact of World War II on Mary Jean's world. Our first reading is from Dorothy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dorothy Dye. I'm pleased to introduce the next section of this presentation. I've been a student, employee, and transcriber with Silver Special Collections since December of 2020, and I began working on Mary Jean Simpson's diaries during that time. And for my section of the presentation, I want to introduce a reoccurring theme, as Erin mentioned before, of women as caretakers as a running theme throughout Mary Jean Simpson's diaries. The notion of women as caretakers is not necessarily a new idea, as scholars and historians have explored the implications of societal and gendered expectations of women. And as a result of this, women have often felt compelled to step into the role of a caretaker, whether voluntarily or out of necessity or both. And for someone like Mary Jean Simpson, who holds her personal and professional relationships and her family to extremely high regard, as one of the core values of her character, it's no surprise that she often puts those individuals before herself and often leaves little room for her to kind of have time for herself to recharge, as she's always putting these individuals before herself, particularly her mother, as we will see. And in the following readings that I'll share from 1937, and this is during the time when Mary Jean Simpson is working with the WPA, as Erin has suggested. And in the next slide, I'll just provide some context before the readings in 1937. And during this time, as Erin suggested before, Mary Jean was very active. She was traveling a lot in Washington, Utah, Nebraska, all with the WPA. And during this time, Mary Jean Simpson has documented that her mother has been staying with her, and Mary Jean must take care of her mother at the same time while attending to these business trips and meeting obligations and connecting with professional partners. As a result of all the traveling, Mary Jean and her mother must return back home to Vermont. And during this time, Mary Jean finds it very challenging logistically and emotionally and mentally and physically to tend to her mother and get her back safely, as she hasn't been doing well. And this is also at a time where Mary Jean Simpson is considering the role of Dean of Women at UVM. And in the next slide, I'll share two readings from 1937, both very close in proximity to each other. And on the left-hand side, we have page 85 from 1937, and this is the moment where Mary Jean Simpson is in the midst of trying to get her mother back home to Waterbury safely. and making sure that her mother is healthy enough to make that trip. She states, came back to find that Dr. Quill had been there and said mother could go. So got her dressed and by means of a chain out to the elevator and into a taxi. Wheelchair of the station, but she was near collapse when we got to the train and into the car. Brandy and spirits of ammonia all night. Mary slept, but I could not lie down even for more than 5 minutes or so at a time. Finally, we got to Waterbury, but she could not walk, so the porter and conductor carried her off the train. And I think this excerpt is particularly striking, considering the logistical challenges that Mary Jean Simpson faced when tending to her mother. And she knew that caring for her mother would be something that she would have to do through her adult years. And there's even some indication of this when she was younger as well in her early diaries. And on the right-hand side, for page 87, this is a moment where they have finally returned back to Vermont, and Mary Jean Simpson has an appointment with then President Bailey of UVM to discuss a potential position of Dean of Women. Mary Jean states, mother a wee bit better this morning, having begun to improve, so Miss B says, about 2 a.m. I felt I just had to keep my appointment with Pres Bailey. The salary, however, is most disappointing, as it is only $2,500, $1,100 less than I'm getting now. But with mother as she is, I feel I ought to get back near home, where I can be with her more, even if it means rigid economizing, which it will at that salary. And again, I think these two excerpts pair well with each other, demonstrating Mary Jean Simpson's very calculated decisions that she must make with regard to her mother, again, with the understanding that she must tend to her mother's well-being and making sure that she's safe and healthy. And we can see here that even in a decision, in a professional decision that Mary Jean might be able to make solely for herself, she's clearly considering her mother's health and well-being at the same time, which is certainly demonstrates her character very well. And now I will pass it off to Mike, who will talk more about Mary Jean Simpson's time as Dean of Women at UVM and a bit more how she got involved in that role.
Thanks, Dorothy. So I'm Mike Maloney. I'm a history major at UVM, and I've been working with special collections on this transcription project since February of this year. And I'll be reading a couple excerpts from Mary Jean's time as the first female bill clerk in the US Senate and as the Dean of Women at UVM. I think both of these roles provide a lot of interesting accounts of her commitment to her work, but these excerpts can also sort of provide us with some insight into how she pushed gender boundaries in the workforce and worked to support other women in their journeys to success. And we're also able to gain to look at how the expectations that have been placed on women in the 20th century as they push those boundaries, including her role as a caretaker, as Dorothy mentioned. And we can see how these expectations drove her to maintain a lifestyle of a very hardworking individual, despite some reservations that she had. So in the next slide, I'll read a couple excerpts from January of 1926. This is Mary Jean's first day on the Senate bill clerk team. She wrote, I woke up feeling somewhat rested this morning and had my breakfast with an egg included to give me strength for the ordeal of the first day at the office. The men were all very nice to me, except Mr. Ives, the printing clerk, who showed me quite plainly that he resented my intrusion into his masculine paradise. I got very little out of the morning's routine except a blur in which Senate bills, record books, and calendar days were badly mixed up. And in May of 1926, Mary Jean writes, woke up feeling fairly tired this morning, had a very busy day. The work grows more exacting now as the close of the Senate session approaches and the rush begins. My private telephone, recently installed, rings constantly, and I hardly have time to finish an entry without several interruptions. Tonight we went home at 5:30 and came back at 8 for a night session on the calendar, which adjourned at 11, having in the meantime passed 82 bills. And I think these provide some insight into how busy she was and how hardworking she was. And this last excerpt from 1926 is at the vice president's dinner in December of that year, where she had a brief interaction with Mr. Ives again. And she writes, Colonel Thayer and Mr. Ives gave me flowers from the tables. We had our pictures taken about 10 times, and I surely was glad I went. And I think, we can gain some admiration for Mary Jean's work ethic from these excerpts, and maybe she was able to work hard enough to prove to Mr. Ives that she was able to be where she earned her right to be there, I guess, and prove to him that she was a hardworking enough individual to work in the Senate. And moving forward to 1937, looking at when Mary Jean was offered the role of Dean of Women by President Bailey, we can gain some insight into the social pressure that she felt to maintain this sort of work ethic and hold up to the standards of society and the people around her. And then, later in 1944, I'll read an excerpt that just sort of shows how hardworking she was and how she was working hard for the girls that she was there for. So in 1937, she writes, "I wish so much now that I had never applied for that job at the university. I'm quite sure that I shall always regret having done so, but mother is so pleased and my friends have done so much that I can't back out now. It will be just one long struggle to keep up appearances and meet all the expenses that go with that kind of job, entertaining, etc., on $2,500 a year." Then in 1944, she writes, "This has been as trying a day as I can remember since I came here, it seems to me. Janet Lee left this noon having shown every evidence of a nervous breakdown. A girl from SAE came in to complain that Miss Bailey is not a house mother. A medic by the name of Eddie Mayo, who was married and whom I've forbidden any of the freshman girls to go out with, came in to ask why, or at least I think that's what he came for. Edith is on a temperamental spree and has slammed the doors and made herself generally disagreeable. Miss Everett has had a bad cold and Miss Bailey is worn out with the problems at her house, so everyone was glad when the day ended. Had a Phi Beta Kappa meeting at 4:30, stayed home this evening." And I think from these excerpts, we can see that throughout Mary Jean's entire career, she was really dedicated to her work, but that she had to hold a level of social, a certain level of work ethic to keep up with the social expectations for what women in the 20th century were supposed to be doing. And I think that could be really helpful for research on that topic of women in the workforce during the 20th century and the social expectations placed upon them. And now I'll pass things on to Tabitha, who will talk about a different aspect of Mary Jean's diary that we explored.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tabitha. First of all, I would just like to apologize for my voice. I lost it yesterday and it has not quite come back. But anyway, I am a student transcriber as well, and I joined the transcription team in September of 2020. And the theme that I would like to talk about today is Mary Jean's use of problematic language surrounding race and ethnicity that we see scattered throughout the diaries. So the image you see on the slide here is a promotional poster for the UVM cakewalk. And we included this imagery because the cakewalk is an event that Mary Jean Simpson participated in occasionally during her time at UVM. And the cakewalk was an event that kind of resembled a minstrel show where fraternity brothers would wear blackface and wigs and perform minstrel show inspired dances. So this was a reoccurring event at UVM while Mary Jean was the Dean of Women. So we wanted to include this as a piece of context to speak to this theme of racial insensitivity during the 1920s. I will go on to delve into more specific passages from the diaries. Before we go on to the next slide, I just want to warn all the viewers that there is some racially insensitive language included in these passages that will appear visually on the slide. Some of these words I will not recite exactly, but they will be written on the screen. So I just want to give a warning to everyone about that. But with that being said, we can move on to the next slide and I will delve into these passages. So throughout this transcription project, we have already gotten to know Mary Jean Simpson through her recounting of her day-to-day life. And as we get to know her, we grow more fond of her every day. With that being said, we have seen her use some problematic language surrounding race, probably due to the historical context of the era that she lived in. And although it's kind of disappointing as a transcriber to see her use this language that would not be appropriate today, it's important to acknowledge and contextualize it so we can reflect on how things were different back then. So the first passage I'm going to point out is from 1924, and Mary Jean Simpson was in New York City at this time. So the passage reads, gloomy but warm, Molly here today, and also a dark complexioned gentleman named Mr. O'Brien, but whom Molly derisively terms a monkey chaser. In other words, a West Indian Negro who washed all the windows and regaled me with an account of his war experiences while he worked. So in this passage, we see Molly, who is a friend of Mary Jean, use a derogatory term to describe a man of color. And Mary Jean puts this word in quotations to indicate that they are someone else's words and not her own. And this racial slur was used to describe Black people or people of Caribbean descent. And although it's not Mary Jean herself who says it, we can gather a somewhat nonchalant attitude that she has towards it. And she does acknowledge that the term was used derisively, but she does not seem very distraught or offended by hearing her friend Molly use this term. So in the next passage, we see Mary Jean use the N-word, which she also put in quotations similarly to the previous passage. So this passage reads, "Busy day as usual, started the packing and also packed a box of marmalade, jam, etc. to send to John in New York. Probably the N-word will steal most of it, but even so, he may get a little of it." So in this passage, we see Mary Jean use the N-word, but it is also in quotations. So it's hard to know for sure, but this could be an indication that this is also someone else's word being used and not her own. But even with that, it's very unfortunate and striking to see this word used in her diary. She uses it kind of passively and seemingly with no hesitation or discomfort. And at this point, Mary Jean is in Craftsbury, and I did a little bit of research, and according to vermonthistory.org, in Vermont after 1924, and this passage is 1925, there was a large spike in racist activity. So consequently, racist language was probably more normal to be used. So in this case, Mary Jean's use of the N-word might suggest a certain normalcy of racism that existed during this time period, especially in Vermont. In the next passage, Mary Jean is describing a Chinese person that she sees in a shop, and at this point she is in New York City. So the passage reads, "Had beefsteak for dinner, James and John both here. Afterwards, James and I walked down Broadway as far as 92nd Street, calling in at my little Chinese shop where the obliging Oriental explained to us about the new Chinese game Mahjong. If it had been less expensive, it was $16. I should have bought a set. It sounds interesting." So in this passage, we see Mary Jean using the same type of passive and nonchalant tone despite the clear microaggression towards this Chinese shopkeeper. Once again, she uses inappropriate language to describe someone's race or ethnicity, and she does so kind of casually and passively, similarly to the other excerpts. So all in all, the reason we want to shed light on Mary Jean's usage of this language is because we feel that it's contextually significant and representative of the era that she lived in. And like I mentioned before, in the 1920s, there was a large influx in racist behavior and KKK activity in Vermont, which speaks to Mary Jean's passive usage of racially offensive language. And during these years, this type of language was probably so common that she became somewhat desensitized to it, or at least desensitized enough to the point where she had no reservations about including it in her diary entries. With that being said, there's only so much that we can gather from these pages, and we don't know for sure how common this language was for Vermonters to use in casual conversation, and we certainly don't know exactly what Mary Jean Simpson was thinking when she wrote these pages. But like I was said, we have all grown very fond of Mary Jean Simpson, and these moments of racially insensitive language are only scattered throughout the diaries, but they're not a consistent reoccurrence or theme in her character or identity as a person. So it's still important to acknowledge them, just so that we can reflect on the lack of racial sensitivity that existed in the 1920s in Vermont and all throughout America. So now I'm going to pass it along to Ibrahim, and he is going to delve into some passages of his own. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ibrahim. I'm UVM student transcriber, and I want to speak about Mary Jean opinion about Second World War and what's going on and media reaction on it. She was quite upset since the media tried to change the public focus from the casualties of Second World War to more positive way because it was the end of the war. New Year came and, well, people started to celebrate because the war was over. Let me read two passages from Mary Jean. This one came from 1944, 31st December. It's about New Year. The war news today is grave indeed, and there is certainly of thousands of brave men dead before we can regain what has been lost. And yet the paper today says, New Year in New York was wilder and gayer. Well, we can see that she's upset about newspaper and their position about what's going on and how it's going on. Meantime, there's another expert about her. I feel guilty about the whole thing, but if the people will come unannounced just at mealtime in this day of short ration, there's not much one can do. Actually, she really participated a lot in the helping programs for people during the Second World War, but she didn't find it worthy of mentioning in her diaries. So without these experts, we probably couldn't even know that there's something going on. Because, well, we can see on her diary some mentioning about addresses, names, and where people went to, but she didn't give any details and tried to be as little about this as possible. Maybe she found it's not so important to write about or something like this, but still she really participated in the helping for people or soldiers and their families. And next I'm going to pass my turn to Christopher Burns.
So we're going to finish with some outcomes and future plans and some reflections before we open it up for questions. So the most straightforward outcome of this work is that we export these transcriptions out of Transcribus, the tool we use, in a number of formats, and then upload that information into our digital collection site so that the items are then available to anyone with the ability to access our site on the internet. In addition, we continue to look at what we're digitizing and transcribing and why. We've brought this work into our public programming through a Transcribe-a-thon event last October. We brought it into the classroom this past year as an exercise for students. One of those classroom exercises has led to a funded project to transcribe 2 diaries of Henry Brownell during the Japanese occupation of China in the late 1930s that are of research interest to the faculty member involved with that project. We will, of course, have to determine how we balance this new workload, which we've gotten pretty good at and which has a lot of value, but is also very time intensive with all of the other work we need to do now that we're returning back to in-person work more completely later this summer. And finally, we've just begun to explore how all of this transcribed data might be useful for digital humanities text analysis projects. And here's a little peek at what that might look like. What you're looking at is a screen capture after we uploaded some of Mary Jean Simpson's diaries into a text analysis tool called Voyant that was developed up the road at McGill University. And here you can see a word cloud of term frequency. Note that mother appeared pretty frequently throughout her diaries. Correlation patterns for the most frequently used word went, the phrases that came before and after went, to examine those for patterns. Frequency of a few terms across the different diaries that are uploaded here became more or less frequent in different diaries, and a few other ways of analyzing this fairly large corpus. To close, we would like to end with a few reflections from our team members before opening it up to you for some questions. So I will hand it off to Hannah here.
Thank you, Chris. So So I think I can speak for the whole group when I say this. We found this project to be incredibly rewarding. What we're doing is not only useful to the researchers who use our collections, but it's also been really fun. And it's a great way to learn more about the materials that are in our collections, as well as the people that we work with. So I've personally enjoyed this project, and I hope to be able to continue transcribing for many months to come.
We also have been searching for opportunities for students to do projects that are more intellectually stimulating and inspiring for them. And I think as our students have demonstrated through their parts in this presentation, that I think that this transcription project has done exactly that. It's been a wonderful opportunity for our student workers.
I can definitely echo what Ingrid said. I think my peers would agree that this has been really an exciting project to get to work on. And it's provided, just for me as a student of history, an interesting insight into the kind of research that can be done with this work. Like the professor that will be using Henry Brownell's diaries later next year, and the topics that my peers and I have discussed previously. And I think also there's just so much more that you can pull out from Mary Jean's diaries and other diaries. Like she has a lot of interesting descriptions of the dresses she buys. So I think, if you're interested in researching 20th century fashion, it could be an interesting tool for that. And there's just so many directions you can go with transcribing diaries.
Yes, I certainly agree with what's been stated, and to go off of Mike's point for sure, as a history student as well, a senior, it's very fascinating, and I feel very gracious to be able to work with this material. And as a result of working with these diaries closely and working as a team collaboratively, we've discussed in this presentation and together the various social and historical issues that have been raised in Mary Jean's work. As we've mentioned, women as caretakers, racist language, questions about gender, and kind of social expectations of women as well. So I think there are so many different pieces, as Mike suggested, in these diaries to work with that can be useful for scholars, historians, or users of the library that are very valuable. And this has certainly been an enriching experience.
Perhaps on a bit of a lighter note, all the diaries I feel have offered a form of escapism, some opportunities to spend some time in someone else's life, in their shoes, and their viewpoints, and their times, and also get away from the problems of our day-to-day lives, especially at such a weird time in the world. Most specifically, I think for me and Mary Jean, her coast-to-coast trip by train across America was kind of a romantic idea when travel wasn't always the safest option or wasn't even possible. Her life overall had a lot of exciting and entertaining elements, and we started to imagine things like a historical novel or a TV adaptation. And it was even richer somehow because it was true and we were seeing it through her eyes and knowing the people in her world. So despite the real life exhaustion and frustration and coming out of that difficult schedule and all of the problems that her mother was dealing with, it was really fun to imagine the best parts of that trip vicariously through the diaries. And we'll open it up to questions now. If folks want to use the chat box or raise their hand, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Maybe we did such a good job presenting that there are no unanswered questions. Mike.
I guess I have two questions. One is, my assumption would be that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of boxes of stuff that would benefit from this. So how do you go about deciding to which box to transcribe? And then the second question is, what strategies are you using to make visible to the rest of the research community that this is now available And mostly thinking about kind of basically discoverability through search engine optimization and such.
So the content selection piece is a good one. You're right. We could transcribe, till the end of time and not even come close to doing everything that we have in our collections. We started with a batch of letters, a batch of 89 letters, and related to your second point about what we sort of do with the stuff afterwards and how we make it available. All of that then requires a little bit of cataloging, a little bit of metadata work, and the sort of price per pound kind of quickly seemed too high for a 2-page letter, a 1-page letter, a 4-page letter. Do you add subject headings to that sort of thing? So that's when we sort of shifted to diaries as something that was, now you're talking 100 pages or 300 pages. And as the person who's doing most of that cataloging metadata work, as opposed to as you see, kind of 8 people doing the transcription work, it seemed like a better workflow. So that was one determination. We sort of looked at some really practical issues like legibility. So we didn't give the most faint pencil written in pencil Civil War diary that was 2 by 2 in size originally. Although these folks will tell you Mary Jean's handwriting isn't what they would necessarily call legible at times, but so we looked at some practical things. We definitely looked at some gender issues. We decided early on to not focus so much on kind of our notable white men who to some extent dominate our collections, and focus more on women's diaries, more on a mix of kind of occupations and professions. So some folks like Mary Jean who had very notable careers, and some folks who led more regular lives, and the diaries focus more on domestic chores. Some of the issues that Tabitha brought up about some of the racial language, racist slurs that came up in the diaries, have definitely led us to reflect, and we're still struggling with this one just because of what our collections are as a Vermont collection, and how well they document non-white folks, people of color, about how to tackle that, how to get other voices into the mix. We've started looking at kind of revisiting our idea of digitizing our student newspaper, which from the 60s on at least starts to get some students of color into the picture. So it's a lot of different factors. And then in terms of making it accessible, they will go on our digital collection site soon, over the summer. Hopefully most of these diaries we've transcribed, which goes into our discovery system through the library, and through you all down at Middlebury, goes through the Digital Public Library of America. So sort of those kind of standard methods that we do for all of our digital collections work, to be determined what additional sort of PR we'll do on some things. The Carolyn Gray Marsh diaries we transcribed last summer have been used by a number of scholars over the years, and some of them are dying to get their hands on these transcribed versions. So some individual outreach for sure will be a piece of that.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Other questions from anyone? If not, I'll do one more additional reflection, which is just to say what a great experience it's been over the last year to really work on this as a big team project. And I think you all got a sense of that today, how we've been sort of working together and figuring out how all the pieces work, both staff and students together. It's been really great and one of the most enriching, rewarding, just kind of work projects that I've been involved with in my 20 plus years in the business. And I'm, listening to everybody speak today, just super proud of all we've been able to accomplish and all everybody's brought to the table.
All right. Well, thank you all.